Mary Efale Jones in Salemburg, North Carolina, January the 28th, 2012, at the home of Betty Holland.
I'm Mary Efale Sawyer Jones, and I was born in the town of the big city of Salemburg. I was born in one of the larger buildings down the street. Dr. Royal was the doctor to deliver me, and he was called to come and deliver me, and I was on the bed that the man that owned the building's mother had died. So I was born on the bed that Mr. Roby Butler's mother died. As soon as I was born, my daddy went back to South Carolina, where he and my mother had come from, and Dad had come up to teach at Salemburg High School as agriculture teacher, and he went to get my grandmother to come stay with my mother, and Miss Garney Butler stayed with mother until he was able to go down there and come back to get her, which was a good trip. In fact, Mother said when she came the first time, she said, "Winfield, will I ever see my home again?" But I was able, from upstairs as I grew up, there are a lot of little stories that come to mind, living up in the building above the streets. And the building had a long porch that went, or we called it a porch, but it was actually a long wooden bit room with windows every so often where we could see out on the street. And at one end was the tree, which was Roby's tree, where he kept his feet on it quite often, every day. And I could see many things from the windows, and if there was something I couldn't see or I wanted to follow through, I could go from one end to the other with no trouble. And of course I saw many sights on Saturdays particular. And then again, the men that were under the street, I often wondered why we didn't hear more of men conversation, but then when I think about it, we made noises as we came down the wooden hallway or porch, and of course they knew we were up there above to hear, so they respected us and kept their special stories till later when they didn't have little ears for listening. But there were many things that we could see from there, and we could always see the cadets as they would come and do their practice for marching. And of course I watched them from upstairs for a long time, but when I got a little older, I wanted to be on the street when they came through, so I could look at the boys a little bit closer. There were many things that I saw from there. And of course, one of the things that stands out in my mind right now is one night under my dad's window, at that time was a service station that had been closed, and people parked underneath it, which that was where Daddy parked his vehicle. And under there, a lot of times, some of the men in town that on Saturday nights would be celebrating a little bit their weekly earnings would sit down there and talk and have their little meetings down there. Well, one particular night, my dad smelled something that was not quite just right. And he thought, well, what in the world is this that I smell? So he goes downstairs to investigate, and when he does, he sees these men, and they were all in their little sleepy mode at that point. And in the back of the vehicle was a skunk. And they had never seen a skunk before. And they didn't know, because in this area we don't have skunks. And so they had never seen a skunk, and they thought it was pretty. So they had, in their activity that night, they had chased the skunk, and of course the skunk was trying to protect himself. And in doing so, he made everything smell very good with his scent. So, needless to say, they had to burn their clothes or discard their clothes. And also, later they sold the car very quickly, as soon as they could, because they never could get the smell out of the car. My uncle, who was a doctor, had been in the Army, and he had been stationed down in Panama for several years. And so he brought my daddy back from Panama a parrot. And she was a beautiful bird, and Dad was very proud of her. And the parrot thought a lot of Daddy. He could just stick his finger in the cage, and she'd get on his finger, and he'd let her fly up and down the long porch. And he'd hold his finger back up, and the parrot would come back, and of course, he would put her back in the cage. If I tried sticking my finger in there, it was a small finger, and I guess the bird thought it was a worm, and she would always snap at it. And she didn't, and maybe didn't like me as well either as she did him. But the parent stayed a lot of times on the porch, because in the summertime in particular. And some of these men that celebrate on Saturday night would get down under the window, and they would go to talking, and they'd get to arguing with one another. And the parent would hear them arguing, and he would repeat what they would say, or she, whichever it was, and she would repeat what they'd say. And of course, as she repeated what they said, it irritated them, and they began to fuss back at her and use all kinds of languages that you could think of. The air would turn blue, and the parrot would repeat what they'd say, and they would say even more. So until Daddy would go and take her and move her and put a cover over her, she would listen and do what. So from then on, when Mother had her missionary society group to meet upstairs, she made sure that the parrot was covered very good and out of sight.
Pat Jones, February the 1st, 2012, in Salemburg, North Carolina, at the home of Betty Holland.
Okay, my name is Russell Pascal Jones. Of course, I have a nickname, Pat. Everybody knows me as Pat, but I was born a couple of miles northeast of Salemburg, and I have an older sister that was 6 years older than I am, or is 6 years older than I am. I have a couple of brothers younger than I am. One of them is deceased now. But we all attended Salemburg Public School. Celeste, my sister, attended Pineland College for 1 year after she graduated in 1941, and she went down to Wilmington and worked in the shipyard during World War II. And while down there, she met this handsome lieutenant who was an Air Force pilot from Virginia, Huntington, West Virginia. And during the war, he was shot down in Germany and was a prisoner of war about a year. And when he came home, they got married here in the Salemburg Baptist Church, May the 30th, 1945, I believe it was. Well, he was still in the Air Force, and they moved around quite a bit. And during this time, she had 3 children, 2 boys and a daughter. And eventually, when he retired from the Air Force, they moved to California, where Jim worked with Lockheed Air Force Corporation. And eventually, when he retired from there, they moved back to North Carolina, and after 2 or 3 moves, Jim, her husband, became ill with Alzheimer's disease, and they eventually moved back to California to be with their children. But going back to Celeste, as we were growing up, Celeste was a very attractive, outgoing girl, very popular. And Kenneth Royal was a classmate of hers, and Amy Lee was a year ahead of her, and Billy was 2 or 3 years behind. But as we were all growing up on the farm, we always came to Salemburg on Saturday night, and my mother always brought butter and eggs that she'd collected during the week to Mr. Ramby Royal's store and exchanged them. And we visited, and so my mother and Dad and Mr. Ramby and Miss Carrie were very good friends. And of course, Celeste grew up with Kenneth and Amy Lee and Billy. And Amy Lee and she dated quite a bit, and I think maybe Kenneth dated her too. But they were very good friends. They grew up together, and Billy was a little younger, but they had this bond between them as they were growing up here in Salemburg, and they all communicated with each other all during their lives, really. And anytime Kenneth and Billy and Amy Lee are in California, they go visit her because they're all such good friends. But Billy, being the youngest, really, I don't think he dated her. But anyway, they're just good friends. They all grew up together, attended Salemburg Public School. Their dad ran the grocery store here, and we all came to town on Saturday night and visited, and they played and dated with each other and what have you. But at the present, she's in California now in a home. She's had 2 or 3 strokes, and physically she's in good health, but her mind is not too good. Obviously, it's hard for her to carry on a conversation with anyone. And she has 3 children, and they all live in California. One of those, the oldest son, passed away a few years ago, but she has a daughter and a son who lives in California, very close to where she's living now, and they, of course, visit back and forth quite a bit. And like I said previously, Billy, Kenneth, Alvin, Amy Lee, anytime they're out there, they always go and visit her because they think so much of her, and she, of course, of them as they were all growing up. They were very close.